welcome to the AT and Osteo Chronicles. I'm Jenna Howe.
And I'm Brynn and today we'll be exploring the gut-brain connection or the gut-brain axis.
And when we think about concussion management, we don't often think about nutrition, although it is part of the conversation more often now, certainly with the type of clients that come into my office with concussion recovery. Yet emerging research suggests that what we may be really significant. It can impact recovery and symptom management.
Today we have Sidney Shindle here with us, a certified holistic nutritionist, and she's going to be sharing a little bit about how the gut and the brain and concussion are all related.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Sidney, and I'm a certified nutritionist. I love to help people to find balance on their plates and in their lives, and most importantly, during concussion management, when they don't really realize that what they eat and how their gut basically works with their food really can affect their recovery process.
And sorry, we'll have to pause that for a
No
second.
worries.
And Sydney, could you start by explaining to the people who are listening to this podcast what you might mean by gut-brain connection or the gut-brain axis?
Absolutely. This is one of my favorite things to talk about in practice across the board with all of my clients, because most people have heard of the saying, the gut feeling, but we don't really put two and two together and realize that our guts and our brains are connected. And it's actually more of like a two-way system. It's bidirectional, or we can think of it like a walkie-talkie. So our brain and our guts are connected through a series of different nerves and connective systems. And one of the most common things that we can talk about and people know about is something called the vagus nerve. So that means that we have our brain talking to our gut and our gut talking to our brain through this bidirectional pathway. And what's really neat about this pathway is not just meant to communicate in the way that we traditionally think about communication of talking. It's mostly done through chemicals. So that means that we can see discussion done through hormones, through immune signals, through even the translocation and discussion of oh my goodness, inflammatory molecules, and sometimes even different types of pathogens can be basically moving up and down through this nervous system or through this pathway. So really cool to see that there's bidirectional communication that happens, and we can call that the gut-brain axis.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. And I know, I think, Brynn, you did some work in your master's degree to do with the vagus nerve. Is that correct?
Yes, so we studied the microbiome of the gut and then its relationship to the gut-brain connection through the vagus nerve and how different ways to stimulate the vagus nerve in order to trigger that response or trigger the response to move the body into that parasympathetic healing recovery.
Yes. Yeah, and that's fascinating because I think both with what Brynn and I both do from a manual therapy perspective of concussion recovery, and osteopathically, it marries very well to Sydney what you're talking about from coming at it from a more nutritional perspective, right? So we've got the external manual therapy piece, we've got the internal um, nutrient piece. I know in osteopathic thinking, originally, Dr. Still, I mean, he had talked about, mechanical forces, psychological forces, but also metabolic, which is exactly what you're talking about in terms of whole health and what
Yes.
can help the individual.
It's so cool. And most people don't realize that what their thoughts are doing actually affect their gut, and vice versa. What their gut is up to can affect their brain. And so the more that we talk about this and the more that we share, like how our mood will affect our digestion or how our sleep affects our digestion or vice versa, what's going on in your gut and like who's living in your gut, that can affect your mood, that can affect your sleep. And especially during concussions, it's super important to talk about.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned microbiome. So can you explain a little bit more about what microbiome means? I think Bryn touched on that too. Just for the people who might be familiar with the term, but don't exactly know what it means or what it represents.
For sure. So the microbiome is like a general term for a colony of living creatures or microorganisms. And there are tons of different microbiomes that exist all over our body. We can think about the microbiome in our armpits if we want to, but let's focus in on the microbiome in your gut. And this is the one that most people talk about. You hear about it all the time on podcasts, on Instagram posts, TikTok, etc. But the microbiome that lives in your gut is basically home to like trillions and trillions of different bacteria. And you can think of it like a giant community. There's various groups of microbes living in your gut, and they all have a different role to play. There are some that are called more commensal or keystone, meaning that they're good, they're very helpful for your gut. And there are some that are considered more opportunistic, let's say not so nice, or there to kind of feed off some things. And if they get out of hand, if they overgrow, then things can go a little bit out of, let's say, out of sorts, and we can start to see some symptoms. But all in all, the microbiome is this community of microbes living in your gut, and they're not just passive things. They're not just kind of living off of you and in this one directional thing, perspective. They actually help you. And I love telling people about this, that who's living in your gut has a huge impact on your digestion. It actually helps when you have the right types of bugs living there. They actually help to create more mucus. They help to create a protective layer on the gut itself. And some of them actually help you to break down your food. They help to regulate your blood sugar, which is really cool. So there's some really cool new research showing that if we have certain bugs that are out of let's say if we don't have enough of certain bugs, we can actually see a higher likelihood of developing diabetes in these individuals. Or we can have some people who have, let's say, a lack of other types of microbes, and we can see changes to their mood. Because what a lot of people don't realize is that the bugs that are in your gut can actually help you to create your neurotransmitters. So your serotonin, your dopamine, your GABA, all of that actually comes as a byproduct, or many of these things come as a byproduct of what these microbes are doing inside of your gut. So this microbiome that you house is actually a wonderful community of creatures that help to contribute to how you live your life every single day.
Wow, that's actually pretty fascinating.
It's really cool. Yeah.
It does look like the research has really grown a little bit. I mean, I think we've all heard about how the microbiome can help digestion, but um, I've never heard that it can help like with diabetes and blood sugar regulation. And that's actually super fascinating.
It's a lot of fun to talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned about the serotonin and the other things, because when we were studying it, they were stating that 90% of serotonin in your body at one time is within the gut. So a lot of those mood, emotions, and things like that are going to be affected by the gut.
100%. Yeah, when your gut is off, your brain feels off. And I'm sure, everyone here has had, I mean, hopefully not, but if you've had food poisoning, if you've had a period where your gut doesn't feel good, you notice how your brain doesn't feel good as well. You notice how, like, in that state of sickness, like, you can't focus the same way. You might feel more brain fog. You might feel like you can't concentrate, or maybe there's more likelihood of kind of veering towards anxiety. And that's not just like that's not in your head. That is actually a sign that there's some imbalances going on in your gut and also in your neurotransmitters, and they are connected. So pretty cool to see the connection there.
Yeah, that's great. And so when we're talking about concussion, because I can see how easily we could go off into different
Oh, yeah.
tangents, and so trying to keep it kind of, back into the world of concussion. What have you found works well with the clients that you've been working with who are suffering from post-concussion?
Yeah.
Either they're coming to you as a result of the post-concussion, or it just happens to be part of their history. Because I imagine for some people, they may not have made the connection between their
Yeah.
head injury and what they're experiencing from their health perspective, gut health, and then, pulling it together. Can you tell us a little bit more about your approach for somebody like that?
Yes. So before I even get into the approach, let me give you a bit of a history about why this even happens and why we really should be focusing on the gut when we're thinking about brain injuries or concussions, any type of condition there where somebody has had a rattling or shaking of the brain. And this can be recent or this can be in their history, as you mentioned as well, Jenna, because a lot of people don't even unfortunately get assessed for concussions, and they'll just say, yeah, I had a period where I hit my head and nobody ever assessed me. But if I look back in their history, there could be part of that triggering why they now have IBS or why they now have digestive issues and they never had it before. So let me explain a little bit about why that happens first, because it'll make a little bit more sense to people who maybe have never heard about this connection. So going back to the vagus nerve and that kind of gut-brain connection, that nerve is very important for regulating our nervous system and how we feel. So that nerve doesn't just go gut to brain, it goes to our heart, it goes to our lungs, and to other parts of the body there, because it helps us to regulate whether we should be in a state of what's called rest and digest or fight and flight. So I'm sure you've had the experience before of when you are more nervous or maybe you're running a race, you notice that you have more your heart is racing, you can have more lung capacity, you're breathing a little bit heavier, etc. But then if you try and eat a meal, you feel absolutely terrible. You feel like there's a rock in your gut. It doesn't digest very well. It feels like it's sitting really heavy. And this can even be for someone who's just come back from the gym and they try and eat a giant meal and it doesn't feel great. So the reason for why that happens is because the vagus nerve will tell us that when we are in a state of stress, and this can be good stress like exercise, or let's say like life stress, our body goes into fight or flight, which means we are working for in the moment purposes, right? We're trying to shunt blood to our heart, to our lungs, so we can exercise or back in the day, run away from danger. And we start to basically phase out or lessen the focus on long-term projects like our immune function and our gut. Because if you cannot outrun the hypothetical danger, like back in the day, a tiger, or now your exercise, then it doesn't matter if you digest your sandwich, because if you don't live, there's no point in digesting your sandwich. So if we are in that state of fight and flight, we downregulate our digestion and our gut motility. But when we are, let's say, not in a state of concussion or have not had any head injuries, after that exercise or after that period of stress, we should be able to, through vagus nerve toning and through just our body going back to baseline, realize, okay, the stress is over. And now it's time for us to go back to long-term projects like wound healing, like muscle repair and digestion. So we see higher amounts of digestive enzyme secretion. We see stomach acid production. We see the motility of the gut improve when we are in a state of what's called rest and digest. So that's a normal kind of process that we should swing between being able to go into a state of stress and then being able to come back to baseline. And that's another talk for another day of why that is not regulated in other people too. But let's bring this back to brain injuries and to concussions, because when you experience a concussion or any type of traumatic brain injury, that actually can mess with the regulation of being able to switch between fight and flight and rest and digest. So the body sees that concussion as a sign of being, okay, we need to be in fight and flight. So this can create more inflammation in the brain because the body goes, okay, we're under stress. This is a problem. And if that's not addressed quickly enough, we can actually stay in this cycle of being more hyper alert. We can be on guard essentially, because the body senses that this has become a stressor that needs to be addressed. So because everything's connected, we now have more focus and more stress going to, or stress management to the brain. And we now see a down regulation of digestion. And oftentimes people will say, okay, I feel nauseous. I feel like I had to vomit. I see loose stools. I see these things that have happened as a result of the concussion. And it's not just right in the moment. This can be something that, even though the major symptoms, dissipate within a few days, there can be minor changes that are going on that people either ignore or think are normal, because in our society, when people have like loose stools or whatever else, they're like, yeah, that's life. Let's go take a, Pepto-Bismol or something like that. But it can be a sign that your body is saying, hey, like there's still some stuff going on in your gut. So the gut-brain connection piece is really important when we're starting to think about why we need to focus on the gut when we're thinking about the brain and concussions. So that's kind of a little piece there. And do you have any questions on that before I jump into the next piece?
No, that's that's great. I think you really touched on all the pieces and how if we have a head injury or concussion, it changes our gut function because it changes the nerves
Yes,
stimulating that process. Then it's the opposite as well. If the gut is not functioning well, it can also affect our brain.
correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and from a symptomology perspective, in our intake form for somebody who's coming to us for concussion-related symptoms, we ask if there's any appetite changes.
Mhm.
And so for some people, they've have a reduction in appetite. For others, um, they end up with an increased craving. That's the word I'm looking for like sugar. And
Yes.
just that high, like that hit, right? They need that dopamine hit, whatever it is,
Mhm. Quick
serotonin, whatever
energy. Yeah. Yeah.
that and so as we're monitoring treatment and treatment effects, that's part of the conversation. How has your appetite changed since your last session? We're working on the physicality of what's happening with the vagus nerve, but also monitoring, okay, well, what are these other pieces that we're looking at that are identifying that things are shifting in your body? And appetite is definitely one of them.
Yes. And to dive into like, yeah, that shift that can happen and to extend on that and how that works in my practice as well is that because it's bidirectional, yeah, we can see changes to appetite and we can see that go to appetite suppression or to people becoming quite ravenous and feeling snacky and like looking for more like quick treats or things that can bring their energy up quite quickly. But we also can see changes that are a little bit more sometimes they're insidious, so it's a slower one, or sometimes it can be quite rapid as far as like the symptoms of digestive disturbances. And the reason why that happens is because of that bidirectional or the bidirectionality of the vagus nerve. If there's inflammation in the brain, we can also start to see inflammation in the gut. And inflammation's a pretty like buzzwordy thing, but it's a legitimate thing. We all carry various levels of inflammation in our body, and like inflammation's natural. But in the case of something like a brain injury, that's a lot of inflammation, and it doesn't necessarily stay just in the brain because of the vagus nerve. We can actually start to see a response in the gut. So the gut is home to not only trillions of bacteria, but a ton of neurons and feeler cells. And if we start to see inflammation in the brain, we can also see inflammation in the cells in your gut. And why that's so important to address is because your gut is absolutely incredible. And I could go on for hours about the amazing thing that is your digestive system. But in a nutshell, in particular, when we get into the intestines and the small intestine, the intestinal layer is very, very small, and that's done on purpose because we need to absorb nutrients, and they need to be like literally like one molecule big, essentially, for us to absorb that from our food. We break it down through digestion, but when we get into the small intestine, it kind of looks like little sea anemone. I do these little jazz hands to demonstrate. But the food particles need to pass between your cell and into the bloodstream in order to get to where it needs to go. But in a case of inflammation in the gut, we can actually see that the food particles, instead of going through the cell, can actually go in between the cells because the layer of your small intestine is one cell deep. And if you remember high school biology at all, one cell is tiny. So that means that you have way more likelihood of things passing in between your cells instead of through your cells, which means that we can have translocation of food particles, we can have translocation of inflammatory molecules, we can have translocation of bacteria that are now in your bloodstream and being carried off to various parts of the body to create more inflammation. And vice versa, we can see inflammation being passed up to the brain. So we see a lot of changes to food sensitivities during or post concussion syndrome. We see a lot of changes to even irritation in the gut because this is why I keep doing this, is that movement of those cells is now what we have confirmed to be called leaky gut or intestinal permeability. So we have more inflammation in the gut sends a response back. We see more inflammatory molecules, we see more immune response there, and this can change what people can digest, what kind of food they're or what kind of nutrients they're actually even able to absorb. And we can see this in the short term, like what some people report after a concussion, but also long term. So down the line as well. And Jenna, that's kind of what you asked me about at the beginning of what I see in my practice and like how I work with that is I've seen people who've come in, and part of my process is asking people about, have you had any concussions? And it's just part of my intake outside of like digestion and asking other things about their lives. And I've seen some really interesting cases come through of people who had a concussion 15 years ago. And then within 6 months, they all of a sudden had digestive symptoms. And ever since then, they've been told they had IBS, or ever since then, they've just not been able to tolerate a certain food. Oftentimes, it's things like gluten and dairy, and they've never known why, and they never put it together that those things were connected, because oftentimes we think about like the gut and the brain being two very separate things inside of our body, but they are connected.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty fascinating with the inflammation. Is there anything that you would recommend for people to help with that inflammation process?
100%. So obviously my realm is food, my realm is nutrition. And when it comes to any concussion protocol, be it something that I've met someone recently who's had this experience, or if it's in their past, it's an anti-inflammatory diet. And there's tons of research around this. There's lots of well-known practitioners, in particular in the chiropractic world, who talk about this. But there's lots of research that shows that if you start to change someone's diet to a very anti-inflammatory whole foods-based diet after a concussion, or even years later, if they have symptoms still, we can start to see changes to cognitive function, to brain fog, to even their digestive symptoms by teaching them to eat a more anti-inflammatory diet. And I can go into that in a nutshell, but basically what that means is these foods are going to help to support the healing process. They're going to help supply the body with a ton of nutrients that your body actually needs to function and thrive, rather than just being a source of just calories, which unfortunately people still think about when it comes to food. Calories are important, but we need to think about what's coming in these calories.
Yeah, absolutely. And are there specific foods that you would recommend?
Definitely. So when we think about specific nutrients, I'm gonna go in from like outside of the macros like protein, carbs, and fats. When we get into specific nutrients, omega-3s are the most researched. So having adequate amounts of omega-3s in your diet post-concussion are extremely helpful, because they are an anti-inflammatory fatty acid that is extremely important to the brain. And the cool thing about omega-3s is that when we think about the cell membrane itself, so if you remember like the cell in high school biology, the skin of the cell is actually made out of fat, and it's made out of a lot of omega-3 fatty acids. So these omega-3 fatty acids can help to line the cell membranes of your brain and other parts of your body. But literally having omega-3s in your diet can help to reduce the inflammatory response, because part of what we can do with omega-3s is basically break them down to create something very anti-inflammatory. So more wild fatty fish, your salmon, your mackerel, anchovies, sardines, fantastic in the diet. And in fact, if you aren't vegetarian, I highly recommend having salmon or wild fish at least a few times a week. If you are vegetarian or vegan, the sources aren't quite the same and you don't quite get the same amount, but that would be your chia, your flax, your walnuts, your pumpkin seeds, etc. would have a bit in there as well. But the goal is to make sure that you're getting enough of the omega-3 fatty acid EPA and DHA. And DHA in particular is extremely potent for helping to reduce inflammation in post-concussion syndrome.
That's awesome. And then beyond omega-3s, is there anything else that you like? What's the next in line, right? So it's like your primary recommendation is like the omega-3s, and then what's the next one down the line?
Oh my goodness. So there are so many, but if we're thinking about, okay, how do we reduce inflammation really quickly? We're thinking about antioxidants, and the world of antioxidants is massive. There are so many different antioxidants that I could talk about, but this is where coming back to the idea of eating real whole foods is just going to give you more antioxidants in the first place. Antioxidants are potent molecules that help to reduce inflammation and reduce oxidative stress. You can kind of think about them as superheroes. They donate a part of themselves to things that are inflammatory, to things that wreak havoc, and they donate a part of their molecule without they themselves becoming a problem. So they can keep like recycling themselves to reduce inflammation. And the best way you can do this is by eating a ton of color. People have probably heard that you should eat the rainbow before, and like many people tell their kids this, but that's a legitimate thing because the color that you see in food is actually representative of the antioxidant content. So when you see like the yellow of a pepper or the red of a pepper or the like the deep blue of a blueberry, that's actually representative of the antioxidant. It comes up as a color. So more antioxidants in the diet can be extremely helpful in a post-concussion protocol. Berries in particular, because they have a very high amount of anthocyanidins that are very potent at reducing inflammation, and they can easily cross the blood-brain barrier. So you're looking at your dark fruits, like your dark berries, your cherries, your blueberries, etc., being a nice part of that plan. And also the polyphenols in olive oil can be another one as well. So getting a very high quality, hopefully single origin, organic, extra virgin olive oil, and having that as part of your post-concussion protocol, that healthy fat can also be extremely helpful, not just because of the monounsaturated fat in it, but because of the polyphenol content of a very good high quality olive oil can also be a useful part of your plan.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't mind adding more berries to my diet.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
it's an
olive
easy
oil.
one. Exactly. Mhm.
Okay, so what about protein? Like I know in some of the research I've done in the past, making sure you get an adequate amount of protein can be really important. I used to do some nutrition like way back in the
Yeah.
day, but things have changed over time. But some of the research I had done before was that potentially sometimes the amount of protein requirements required for
Yeah.
tissue repair tend to go up. Is that still something that's true? What are your recommendations when it comes to bringing in an adequate amount of protein post-concussion?
1,000% for a couple of different reasons. So when we think about instating an anti-inflammatory diet, oftentimes people might be coming from a, let's say, not so great diet where there's more junk food, there's lots of imbalances in the ratio of protein, carbs, and fats. And so by adding in adequate protein from that perspective, that just helps with blood sugar regulation, and it will help them to be more adherent to the diet anyways, because blood protein is extremely satiating. It helps to keep your blood sugar stable. It helps to keep you full. So that's going to be very helpful as part of the protocol anyways. From that perspective, I could talk about blood sugar forever. But from the actual healing benefits, people don't realize the importance of protein. And it's what I spend a lot of time in my practice talking about, is that it's not just for bodybuilders, it's not just for athletes. Your protein becomes your hair, your skin, your nails, anything with structure inside of your body. So your muscles, but also various types of tissue in your body as well is made out of protein. And diving even deeper than that, protein breaks down into individual building blocks, and I like to look at them as Lego. So all those different colored Legos have a different purpose. And amongst the building blocks of protein, these amino acids, they can go on to make things like neurotransmitters. They can go on to make various types of immune cells. So having enough protein in your diet and therefore the right amount of specific amino acids can be extremely important during a time of healing, because your body is going through a lot of repair work, which means that we need more raw material or more building blocks in the first place. But we also need adequate amounts of these building blocks to make sure that we have the immune cells that we need to do the repair work inside the body, that we have adequate amounts of these building blocks to make the neurotransmitters that we need to feel good as part of a post-concussion syndrome as well. So protein, 100% extremely important, and making sure you have some at every meal. That's a big part that I find that people don't realize, is that they have maybe protein with dinner only. But in my world, for the blood sugar management piece, which is extremely important during a concussion protocol for helping to reduce inflammation, but also to make sure that you're getting this material in on a very regular basis, is having what I like to call an anchor of protein at every single meal, depending on height and weight and things. That can look roughly about like 25 to 30 grams at each meal, or sometimes even more, depending on what this who this person is.
That's amazing.
And just one last important thing to note about protein is that when I mentioned these building blocks, these pieces of Lego, there are what we call essential amino acids or essential building blocks. And without those building blocks, we can't make other building blocks. So when we're looking at making sure that someone has adequate protein, if they are omnivorous, if they eat animal products, then they are likely going to be getting enough of these essential amino acids that are very important for rebuilding, in particular the BCAAs or branched chain amino acids that are found in higher amounts in animal-based foods. But if we have someone who is vegetarian or vegan, then we do want to make sure that when they are thinking about getting protein in the day, they do need to look beyond just like the count of protein that would often come if you're looking at, let's say, beans or legumes, or seeds even. You want to make sure that you are focusing on what's called a complete protein, meaning that this food that is plant-based or animal-based, but plant-based here, has all of the essential amino acids in the right amount. So this is where making sure that they're getting enough complete amino acids from things like soy products, so tofu, tempeh, even soy milk, organic, all of it being organic, would be a very helpful part of their protocol to make sure that they're getting more of these essential amino acids that are super important for synaptic repair, for neurotransmitter synthesis, and much more that if they were just, let's say, just eating chickpeas, they wouldn't be getting. So very important to take note of that differentiation there.
Thank you. Just to sort of backtrack a little bit on microbiome, I've often heard that eating fermented foods can really help with the microbiome. So can you speak a little bit to the fermented foods and how they help and what type of fermented foods are ideal, or if there's any fermented foods that are not ideal?
Yeah, great question. So what a lot of people don't realize is that the food that you eat doesn't just contain nutrients for yourself. So we're thinking about proteins, carbs, fats, vitamins, and minerals, but the food that you eat also fuels your gut microbiome. So if we are eating more whole nutrient dense foods, we have more fiber, we have some fermented material, that can actually feed more of the good microbes in comparison to some of the processed food that I'm sure we'll get into in a bit, can feed the not so nice bugs. So when we're thinking about supporting the gut microbiome, people will often ask about, okay, should I be eating a ton of fermented foods? And my answer about this really depends on if you already have sensitivities to some of these things. So if you are someone who is sensitive to, let's say, having fermented foods, like if you have kefir or sauerkraut or kimchi and you notice that you feel like gassy and bloated, those foods likely aren't going to be helping you right now. They might be feeding an overgrowth of some not so nice bugs. But if you don't have any of those symptoms, then having a bit of fermented natural food in your diet could be an absolutely fantastic part of just helping to feed some of those nice bugs because of the lactobacillus species that come in on real fermented products. So we're talking about the type of sauerkraut and kimchi that you find in the fridge section that when you open it, it fizzes and it bubbles. And if you have some on your tongue, like it feels kind of sparkly, not the one that's in the aisle that's cooked and you don't even need to keep it in the fridge. So real living sauerkraut or kimchi could be part of that. A little bit of yogurt or kefir if there's no dairy concerns there could be nice to help to promote basically some of the nicer bugs that live in your gut. Other things that we can do to fuel the gut microbiome would be giving them fuel, because the lactobacillus species that come in on the fermented food just help to increase their amounts. But if we're looking at the fuel for the gut bugs, they actually like fiber and they like specific types of fiber. And we call this prebiotic starch or prebiotic foods. And you kind of hear this term of probiotic or prebiotic. The probiotic are the things that are living that actually contain some of these cultures that can help us to kind of regrow who's living in our gut. Whereas the prebiotic foods are things that help to fuel the bugs that already live there. So these are different types of fiber that can feed these happy bugs inside of our gut. And once we feed them, they can create amazing byproducts like butyric acid that help to reduce inflammation in the gut and so much more. So we find probiotic starch in a ton of different things, garlic, onions, asparagus leeks. We also find it in cooked and cooled rice, which is really neat. So the more you cook and cool like rice and potatoes, you actually create more of this resistant starch that fuels your good gut bugs. So that can be part of that protocol too. Also things like plantains and more greenish bananas can be something that can give you more of this prebiotic fuel for these good gut bugs. But the caveat to this is if you have like if you are very sensitive to if you have gas and bloating and pain when you eat onions and garlic and these types of fiber, then that's a sign for me that there's already some sort of overgrowth or kind of dysbiosis in your gut that we need to address, and maybe those foods aren't for you at this time in this protocol. And that can be something that we dive into as part of your healing process of, do we need to go for further gut testing? Do we need to know who's living in your gut so we can actually make a very specific protocol for you? So keep that in mind if you start to eat more of those foods and things go the not so nice direction, gas, bloating, loose stools, take those out and just focus on the anti-inflammatory foods that we've been talking about.
So what if somebody doesn't really like fermented foods? I would put myself in that category. I don't love fermented foods. I mean, as fermented as I get would be kombucha. And I don't mind yogurt. I can't stand plain yogurt, and I can really only eat it a couple of times a week before I start to feel just not great. So is there any kind of strategies or tips for those people like myself that just really cringe at fermented foods?
Totally fine. I get it. And yes, the first thing I'll say is don't have kombucha as part of like your healing protocol. I'm sorry. Most people will drink kombucha with that thought of, yeah, it contains a bit of probiotics. But unfortunately, the
Sugar.
way that kombucha is made is that it's made with sugar. You need to feed the SCOBY or the mother that lives in the bottom of it. If you've never seen one, it looks like an alien. It's so cool. But it needs sugar. And yes, it does ferment some of that sugar, but there's still sugar left over in that drink. And most people will drink like a whole kombucha, which is going to have too much sugar for what we're looking for at this point in someone's protocol. So that's more like a pop than anything else.
Yeah.
So yes, not the ideal way to do that. If someone is not a huge fan of fermented foods, then to be honest, like working with a full spectrum probiotic is totally safe and fine to work with. I know we haven't really touched on supplements yet, but that could be something that somebody tries instead, and focusing on the prebiotic foods instead to fuel who's already living in your gut, and really focusing on the anti-inflammatory foods, the adequate amounts of protein, really keeping it low sugar, low processed foods to not fuel the not so nice bugs, and then focus on feeding the good bugs with fiber, with tons of vegetables, with tons of anti-inflammatory foods. So if fermented food's not your thing, sometimes it's like a little bit of reintroducing or introducing it super slowly and trying to change your taste buds. But I get it. It's not everyone's cup of tea. So sometimes it just goes around like, how do we meet this client where they're at? So we focus on other things instead.
That's really good to know, because yeah, I would say, like, I'm one of those people that I don't think there's ever been a time in my life that I've enjoyed anything fermented. I would have a harder time trying to implement that into my life in an enjoyable way. But if I knew that there was other ways that maybe may not be quite as awesome, but can kind of get me to that end goal
Yeah.
in a more enjoyable way, that's really good to know, because I know some people kind of like, oh, I can't do fermented foods, and say, oh, then forget about it. I know somebody in my family who's very black and white, and it's like, well, if I can't do
Yes.
that, then I can't do anything. So it's nice to know that there are definitely ways around to still get the benefits, for people who maybe have, or they have food aversions. I've worked
Yeah.
with post-concussion people who they could tolerate hardly anything.
Yeah.
And so it just they would have just probably thought about vomiting if you tried to introduce just about anything that had
Yes.
flavor to it. So that's really good to know that from your perspective, there are ways that you can meet people where they're at, and guide them to that healthy microbiome, healthy gut brain axis.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's wonderful.
The goal is always to meet people where they're at. And I find similarly in my practice too, there's some people who come in with this all or nothing mentality of like, if they can't do it all, then why bother? Because they don't think it's going to work, or they don't think it's going to be as effective. And truth be told, I mean, if you take one step in this direction, you've already made a shift that somebody else hasn't. Or if you hadn't done that, like you wouldn't see the benefits. So if you are able to implement so many parts of this protocol, but you're like, hey, I don't like fermented food, you're still going to see changes to how you're feeling. And in some cases too, like sometimes that food aversion is a legitimate thing. Sometimes like it's a gut brain thing of, hey, like I don't want this. And I actually like legitimately don't need this because it's not what my body's asking for. And then, I mean, we'll talk for another day too. Sometimes it's just retraining taste buds because in our North American palate here, we're very like sweet and salty based. So sometimes the fermented foods and just like the bitter aspect of a lot of these foods is just overwhelming for some people. So sometimes it's as simple as, yeah, like yogurt once a week, that's unsweetened with some berries and like thawed berries when you leave them to thaw overnight, they're so sweet because you get the little like berry juice on top. And that can be a way to like retrain your taste buds, but you have that once a week. And then you can slowly start to kind of integrate that in as you see fit. So always meeting people where they're at is my view on the world, at least.
I'm going to digress a little bit just because I have a question about something. Since you're talking about the probiotics, when we were in school, one of the things they said was when people are on antibiotics, they're killing off all of it, and that probiotics are really, really important when you're on those. But it was never explained how much or kind of how to do it.
Yeah, so most people don't realize that when they take a round of antibiotics, they are basically wiping out, the good, the bad, the ugly. They're wiping out most of who's living in your gut, and it can take a couple of years, depending on whose research you're reading, for your gut to rebuild and to kind of come back to where it was before that exposure to antibiotics. So I've seen a lot of people who go through what's called antibiotic associated diarrhea, and they start to see like changes to their gut. They start to see more pain or loose stools or more gas after that exposure to antibiotics. And working with a round of probiotics can be extremely helpful for that. But then we get into the like wild world of probiotics and like what's in a probiotic and like which ones do we need. And that's a like whole 5 to 10 hour long discussion. But in a nutshell, when somebody takes a round of antibiotics, you can actually take probiotics at the same time. It's just a couple hours apart. So you'd want to take a probiotic 2 to 3 hours after or before taking the antibiotic. And in the first line of defense, what's usually recommended is a probiotic that will contain one particular strain that's called Saccharomyces boulardii. I know that's a mouthful, but Saccharomyces boulardii, if you just even try and type that into Google, you will find out what it is. But that particular strain is actually a beneficial yeast that likes to go around and eat not so nice bacteria and different kind of pathogenic things. And that helps to reduce some of the negative effects of the antibiotics that people will, like the diarrhea or loose stools that people experience when they take a round of antibiotics. And then from there, you can just go through like a full spectrum probiotic, usually something that contains like 10 billion plus CFUs or colony forming units, something that has I mean, when you go into specific strains, you can go on forever and talk about it for too long. But in a nutshell, that has a little bit of both animal and non-animal based strains. And bonus, if you can get some that have human strains, just having a full spectrum can be quite useful for replenishing the gut. Some of the ones that come to mind that are very helpful for replenishing are Lactobacillus rhamnosus and plantarum and salivarius. Those are kind of some of them that can be quite useful, but the talk can go on forever. But looking for one, yes, that is full spectrum after the first round that has the Saccharomyces boulardii, and also listening to your gut, because sometimes people will have a negative reaction to a probiotic as well. And that's when it's time to come and chat with somebody like a nutritionist or a naturopath, or even going to a really great integrative pharmacy where you have somebody there who knows what they're talking about and they can walk you through that.
And just keep it 2 to 3 hours from the.
Yes. So follow the instructions on the back of the container of how many you should take a day, but just make sure that you're taking it at least 2 to 3 hours away from the antibiotic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've talked a lot about what to eat, which has been really great, comprehensive, lots of really wonderful information. And I would assume, obviously, moving away from processed foods, but is there anything specific that you would like to highlight with your post-concussion people in terms of what to avoid? Because I know that this conversation can be tricky with teenagers or university, varsity athletes, and those people with food aversions. But if you've got like a top 5 or top 10 things to avoid, what would those be?
Great question. And I love how you asked about what to eat first, because I find a lot of times people will ask what not to eat. And when you focus on what not to eat, then you're going to think about what not to eat. And then you're going to want to eat those things. And that's just how psychology works, right? If you say don't eat chocolate, then you're going to be like, well, no, I want to eat chocolate. That's life. So before I even get into the few things that I like to avoid, I'd love to just kind of summarize and remind people of what they should be eating. And this is really helpful, I find, for teenagers, varsity athletes, or to be honest, adults too, is making sure that when you're building that plate, you're not just looking at it from a caloric perspective, you're making sure that you have adequate amounts of proteins, carbs, fats, and fiber. So that anchor of protein really helps because it keeps you satiated. Those healthy fats that I mentioned help to keep you satiated and nourish yourself. And when we have adequate fat in our diet, we tend to not crave as much sugar. And then making sure you have a ton of vegetables on your plate. Most people don't realize that you should be having like 2 to 3 handfuls of vegetables at lunch and dinner, because that also helps with making sure that you're fuller for longer. It helps to increase fiber. It helps to slow down your blood sugar and make sure you don't get massive rises and falls. And then when we start to talk about what not to eat, you already feel satiated, nourished, and satisfied. So then talking about what to cut out doesn't feel as daunting because you know what should be on your plate on a regular basis. One of the first things that I do like to cut out is added sugar and basically processed foods. So those are the top 2 kind of things that I really like to discuss. So that's why we talk about adding in the protein, carbs, and fats, and really focusing on whole carbohydrates. So we're looking at like sweet potatoes, yams, quinoa, millet, even a bit of white rice I'm not concerned with, so long as you have other things on the plate. But we're looking at doing that. So then when we say, okay, less added sugar or no refined carbohydrates, no packaged carbohydrates, it seems less daunting. So sugar is a massive culprit for inflammation. Sugar does this in a couple of different ways. But number one is the spike of blood sugar that happens when we have just large amounts of sugar coming into the system at once. This can increase inflammation in your bloodstream throughout the entire body. And sugar's in everything. A lot of people don't realize how much sugar they eat because of the fact that it's hiding in pasta sauces, it's hiding in your, frappuccinos, it's hiding in your kind of all these processed products. So when we start to look at reducing sugar, the first thing is actually looking at packages and starting to read the information or the ingredient list. So that's a big thing to be mindful of. In Canada, we actually have a law that we have to list the ingredients by weight. And in Canada, all sugar is lumped together. So if you start to look at the ingredient list and it says sugars as one of the first ingredients, that's a sum of all of the different sugars that exist in that product. And you might start to notice like 6 different names for sugar, all kind of in brackets. And that's how companies kind of get away with making it seem like it's less sugary. But yes, looking to avoid things that have sugar as the first or second ingredient can be really helpful. Looking at the nutrition facts to see added sugars, because a lot of products have added sugar in it. And that's also now something by law we have to list. And also trying to avoid the refined carbohydrates. So that's like your potato chips, your French fries, your, bags of cookies, popcorn, etc. Really focusing on real whole nutrient dense foods, in particular in the first few weeks of a post-concussion protocol, can make a massive difference in somebody's ability to recover faster, less brain fog, etc.
Amazing.
And then I actually have one more. If we're going deeper into it and someone's quite invested in doing this, then we start to think about the other things that can hide in processed food. And this can be oils that are more inflammatory. So these would be the seed oils. There's 2 camps of people around seed oils. I am definitely anti-seed oil, in particular in a protocol like this. So your canola oil, your sunflower oil, your soybean oil is going to have, one, been processed in a way that makes it less, it has no taste to it. But how we get to that point is by exposing it to heat and to chemicals. So it is more stable. It can be, deep fried, etc. But it lacks nutrients, and it also has more likelihood of becoming a kind of problem inside of your body because of how it's been processed. So the other thing about these fats or these seed oils is that they do contain more of what's called omega-6. And we need a balance of omega-3 and 6 in our diet. But in a modern diet, we have way more omega-6 because of the exposure to these, seed oils that are in everything from chips to popcorn to pasta sauce and so much more. And so when we don't have enough omega-3 and we have too much omega-6, our body can actually overproduce inflammatory molecules, and that can lead to more inflammation systemically, more joint pain, etc. But in particular, in a protocol like this, it can lead to more inflammation in the brain, because as I mentioned about omega-3s, they line your cells. Omega-6s can do that too. So really being mindful of reducing seed oils can be a big thing that can be helpful for a protocol like this. And obviously just the added preservatives and chemicals that are found in these foods, which make them more addictive, which make them all sorts of not so nice things. Long story short, reducing and hopefully eliminating processed foods during the periods after or during a anti-inflammatory protocol can be quite helpful.
Fantastic.
You,
So, oh, you go
I
ahead,
was just
Brynn.
gonna say, you said which oils to avoid.
Mhm.
Which oils could they replace them with?
So if we're looking at my number one recommendation for not heating would be olive oil. Olive oil is such a fantastic oil. It's so nutrient dense. It contains not only your monounsaturated fatty acid, but the polyphenols, like I mentioned. There's some vitamin E in there too, which is also very anti-inflammatory and helpful for the brain. The trick about that is finding one that actually is like 100% extra virgin. Looking for first cold press, single estate can be great as well, organic. But finding a high quality olive oil, using that mostly for not cooking, but for salads and for kind of blending in that way, or very low heat cooking could be an option. And then for higher heat cooking, a refined avocado oil is actually quite safe to work with. It's also relatively anti-inflammatory. There's no concerns about high omega-6 in that one. And then even honestly, grass-fed butter is a great option if you're looking to have a little bit of low temperature cooking, because grass-fed butter is high in something called butyric acid, which I've alluded to with your microbes as well. But butyric acid can be quite helpful as a fuel source for your brain and also for your gut. But a little bit of grass-fed butter or ghee could be an option too, if that's something that somebody's open to working with. A little bit of coconut oil in there as well would be okay. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm.
So I'm just wondering if we should touch on alcohol and caffeine. I think most people understand reducing alcohol seems like an obvious, but I'm not sure that caffeine is super obvious for people, especially if they're experiencing fatigue post-concussion.
Yeah.
I feel like, and in the people who are fatigued but still need to go to school and work, and really relying on the caffeine to kind of give them just any kind of
Yeah.
energy to sort of force them through the day. What are you, I think maybe like briefly touch on alcohol, because I think that's super important, but maybe more importantly, touching on the caffeine connection.
Yes, 100%. I mean, I think we all know that alcohol is not great for us, and there's so much more discussion around that and awareness of reducing alcohol intake in general these days. But definitely for an acute concussion, like you want to be avoiding alcohol for at least a few weeks after that completely. But in general, reducing your intake is extremely important. We know that alcohol is inflammatory. We know that it can change your blood sugar and your metabolism, but it also changes sleep quality. And a lot of people don't realize that. They think that it's something that helps them to wind down at the end of the night, but it actually interferes with the quality of your sleep. You don't get the same amount of deep sleep or REM sleep when you have alcohol. So while it might help you fall asleep initially, you do not get the same quality of sleep. So obviously avoiding alcohol would be fantastic. With caffeine, also something quite interesting for the first 2 to 4 days, it would be ideal to completely cut out caffeine, which I know is really hard for some people. So if that means switching to matcha, that would be something worth looking into, because there is a little bit of benefits from the antioxidants that are found in the matcha. And there's also some L-theanine in there, which is pretty cool. But ideally for the first 24, 48 to 72 to even 4 or 5 days after, if you can do it, it just helps to make sure that you aren't basically seeing changes to your sleep. So with caffeine, caffeine has some pros and cons as far as like its ability to it helps with brain function in some capacities, but I don't want to like tell people too much about that because then they're going to be like, well, caffeine post concussion. But in the time around like after a concussion, you don't want to excite your brain too much. And I'm sure you've all had that feeling with a cup of coffee where we feel a little bit more excited and awake and alert. And that can actually have a negative response post concussion because it can change the blood flow in the brain and can basically start to impede on the body's natural ability to heal because of that blood flow change that's happening while someone is taking caffeine. So ideally, first few days to avoid it completely, and then that becomes very situational dependent after that. The big thing, though, is a lot of people don't realize that caffeine lingers in the body for a really long time. So if we think about the other downside to caffeine is that it affects your sleep quality. So most people don't know that the half-life of caffeine is like 5 to 8 hours, meaning that 5 to 8 hours later, you have half of the amount of caffeine still in your body. So if you're using that caffeine at 2 or 3 p.m. as a pick-me-up to get you through the day, which often can happen when you're going through the healing process after a concussion, because it's hard to get through a day, if you are drinking a cup of coffee in the afternoon, that is actually going to be affecting your sleep quality, whether you know it or not. So you want to try and avoid having coffee past noon if you are going to have a coffee, even in the weeks after a concussion, to try and avoid changes to your sleep quality. So that's something extremely important to take note of. And if someone's looking to improve their energy and their focus, obviously caffeine is something that we can easily turn to. But what most people forget about is water. We haven't even touched on water yet. You need to make sure that you are drinking so much water. And concussion or not, most people start their day with a cup of coffee and they don't even have a glass of water because it's coffee first. So make sure you're having at least 3 to 4 to 500 mils of water first thing in the morning and aim for at least 2 to 3 liters of water during this time to help support your energy, to help support moving the nutrients to where they need to go in your body, to help support digestion and so much more. Like that's actually going to be a key piece of increasing energy and focus is making sure you have enough water in your day as well.
Amazing. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So another, as you mentioned, some people may have issues with sleep. Concussion can also cause that and impact how they're recovering because we know that sleep is linked with recovery. Is there anything that people can do to help improve their sleep?
Sleep is such an important part of recovery and just in general, and a lot of people don't get enough sleep. There's a few different things here. Before we even get into the nutrient pieces, just how you actually set up your room for sleep is so important. So I meet a lot of people who don't realize how much light they have in their bedroom. And there's really cool research that shows that just like the light photons on your skin can help or can actually affect like how long you sleep and how deeply you sleep for. So making sure you have blackout curtains, using an eye mask, if that works for you, could be a nice way to make sure that you're able to sleep later into the day, especially when it's, summertime and the sun starts to come up at like 4:45 in the morning. You want to make sure that you have a nice dark room. Cool room can be quite helpful for that. Obviously, people are told to avoid screens around concussions, and that's extremely important. So no phone before bed, not just for the piece that most people are told around concussions is that it's excitatory to the brain and it can stimulate, but it also changes your melatonin secretion. So when we have more blue light exposure, this changes melatonin and our ability to create and secrete melatonin. So removing as much technology before bed as possible can be really helpful. Or if you do need to use screens, then you want to make sure that you are using like a blue light protector, or even there are great companies like Flux. It's a free program you can put on your computer. It's f.lux that can basically filter out the blue light from your screen. And that could be something useful to think about. And then when we get into how they can actually help themselves with sleep, food plays a huge role in this. And that's where we come back to the anti-inflammatory diet. The less blood sugar highs and lows you have in your day, the more likely you're going to sleep through the night. So that's fantastic. I meet a lot of people who wake up at 2 or 3 a.m. because their last meal is at like 8 or 9 at night. And it's usually chock full of like processed carbohydrates or too many carbohydrates or like after dinner snacks. And then they wake up at 3 and they wonder why. And oftentimes that has to do with like a blood sugar high and fall. And they wake up because their blood sugar is actually low because they've eaten too much sugar. So that's one thing. Not eating too close to bedtime is another really big one, is making sure that you stop eating by like 7 or 8 p.m. And going back to digestion quickly before, you got to chew your food, especially during a protocol like this. Most people do not chew their food. And as part of the healing process, you want to be like really slowing down to eat your meals and chew very slowly, because it actually does help with the healing process in the gut and then therefore the brain. But yes, avoiding food at least a few hours before bedtime. So like 7, 8 p.m. cutoff is a really nice thing to do there. And then we can get into specific nutrients. Protein-rich meal at dinner, very helpful. Not too many carbohydrates, but enough that that can help you obviously not wake up in the middle of the night. When it comes to melatonin, people will talk about like tart cherry juice before bedtime, and that can be an interesting, it's the only thing that has natural melatonin in it, but to be honest, I actually would recommend a little bit of melatonin if that's tolerable for someone in their protocol. It's a pretty safe supplement to work with. And the other thing is that melatonin is actually not just a hormone, it's actually an antioxidant. And it's extremely anti-inflammatory in the brain. So microdosing melatonin is the best way I like to put this, like 0.75 milligrams or like 1 to 1.5 milligrams before bed can be extremely helpful. Sometimes I find more is excitatory. It can be dosed really high in some protocols, especially for like cancers and things. But for a concussion, like 1 to 1.5 and staying around there can be quite useful so you don't get the brain fog in the morning, and helping, yes, with making sure that you're getting basically like the right circadian rhythm to help with the healing process. There's also other supplements, but I won't go into that just yet. So we'll keep it just with the food-based recommendations for now.
Amazing. And so some questions that I'll get in my practice is symptom specific nutrition. So what could somebody eat, for example, for the headache? So you've just mentioned sleep and some sleep recommendations. Headaches are a huge post-concussion
Yeah.
piece. Obviously, the cognitive function, brain fog. So do you have any potentially symptom-specific recommendations for the types of symptoms that you see in your practice related to post-concussion?
100%. Headaches, we're looking at magnesium. Magnesium is such an amazing mineral. Most people in North America are mildly deficient in it because we don't have a lot in our soil. So we actually use magnesium on a regular basis for lots of different things. It actually, it's tagged to basically most energy molecules in our body. So when we're more stressed or when we exercise more or when we're in a healing phase, we actually go through more magnesium. So having adequate magnesium in your diet can be challenging, but it does come in, dark leafy greens and nuts and legumes. But I do recommend working with a supplement on that. And that's where talking to a practitioner can be really helpful. But magnesium glycinate is quite well tolerated, usually about 200 to 400 milligrams as a minimum. And then if you want to talk to practitioners, there's a very particular cool version of magnesium that's bound to threonate. And magnesium threonate crosses the blood-brain barrier. And it's commonly used in concussion protocols to help reduce neuroinflammation and to reduce some of these symptoms that people experience.
Thank you. You've given us so many great recommendations for concussion recovery and much more. I guess the final piece is, do you have any approaches for those that when they're struggling with a concussion, they may have difficulty in planning this all out, thinking about it? Are there any ways that you can suggest to help them actually implement it?
Simple, keep it simple. So if anti-inflammatory foods is, when you look at that and you start to look up recipes and there's 10,000 steps in a recipe, and that feels daunting, keep it simple. If that means doing a Costco shop and getting box salads and getting some pre-made chicken that has no oils on it, just maybe it's like the frozen chicken breast and you're cooking it, that's fine. It's really about making it as easy and approachable as possible for the individual. If that means batch cooking meals, if that means sheet pan meals where everything goes on one tray, that's the way I'm looking at it, is trying to make it as simple as possible for somebody. Or if you have the funds, like working with someone who can prep your meals during that time, that would be fantastic. Or asking friends and family to help out, that could be something else worth doing. But at the end of the day, just keeping it simple. A lot of people feel like eating anti-inflammatory is daunting and it requires 1,000 steps and lots of money and, really fancy ingredients. But if you think about what real whole food is, that's things like beans, legumes, whole grains, protein, healthy fats. and obviously spices. So it doesn't have to be boring and bland either. But if that means that you have a handful of meals on repeat that are nutrient dense and you keep those, in your back pocket, then that works for you. Or if you feel like you've got the energy to go through, fancy recipes, go for it. But try and eat a rainbow on your plate, try and have some protein at each meal, drink enough water, and that is going to get you in the right direction for sure.
That's amazing. You're talking with you today has been so informative. So I can't imagine how many people are going to actually benefit. So if they make their way to our discussion today, I think that's amazing. And for anybody who'd like to work with you directly, can you give us your information? We're going to post it anyway, along with the video. But if you can just give people an idea of where you're located, how to get in touch with you, yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. So I work both in person and online. I'm located in New Westminster as well as in North Burnaby at 2 different clinics there. You can reach me at veritaswellness.ca or on Instagram at veritaswellness. And I love to work with people on finding the right kind of protocol for them. It's meeting people where they're at and making change one step at a time. So if this has been interesting for you and you just want to reach out and have a chat, I do offer a free 15-minute consult so people can learn a bit more about my approach and I can learn more about what is going on in your world so we can figure out if we're the right fit and where we can go one step at a time.
Amazing. I just followed you now. Otherwise, I'd probably forget. That's awesome.
Thank you for joining us. I feel like I've been given so much good information that I could implement today.
Yeah,
Awesome.
absolutely. Absolutely. You've answered so many different questions, so well-rounded. Yeah, it's just really fantastic. And I think everybody's going to really enjoy listening to this episode. And having said that, I thank everybody who's listening to the AT and Osteo Chronicles. Thank you, Sidney, for joining us today. Yeah, and we'll sign off for today. And if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them, and then we can direct you over to Sidney's information as well.
Thank you so much for having me today. This was a ton of fun.